It has been close to 20 months now since TPLF instigated war in the northern part of Ethiopia. TPLF has been using the innocent people in Tigray for its war propaganda by deliberately disrupting the humanitarian efforts being carried out by various organizations. In March 24, 2022, the government of Ethiopia had declared an indefinite humanitarian truce, realizing the need to take extraordinary measures to save lives and reduce human suffering in the region. Following the declaration, large amount of international aid has been reaching into Tigray region. The international community is expressing applause for this encouraging move made by the government of Ethiopia to facilitate humanitarian aid flow to Tigray by all means of transportation. However, several observers, including the government of Ethiopia, have been expressing their concerns as to the proper distribution of the aid to the people in need. For instance, a recent research conducted by Professor Anne Fitzgerald indicated that large majority of the aid in Tigray is being diverted by TPLF to other purposes. A foreign journalist and observer of northern Ethiopia conflict, Scoop Independent News Editor-in-Chief Alistair Thompson told ANA this week that the concerns being raised by several observers about the humanitarian operation in Tigray is a serious issue.
When it comes to the issues of what's happening inside Tigray, we have very little data on that. But Professor Anne Fitzgerald published this paper in April, where she interviewed IDPs who had left Tigray and then fled into Wag Hemra and into Sokoto. And I'll just read this passage in her report about what she was told by the IDPs about what was happening inside Tigray. When civilian respondents were asked about the issue of aid deliveries, all confirmed that only a small amount of aid was made available to those families who contributed fighters to the rebel force under a one fighter per family rule. Very little or no aid would be given to families that did not have fighters to contribute. All civilian respondents felt that no matter how much aid flowed into Tigray regional state, priority would always be given to the TPLF leaders, some select TPLF-linked businessmen who were given the staples like oil to sell in their shops, and the fighters. When asked whether the humanitarian organizations working in Tigray would challenge this form of aid distribution, all respondents explained that these organizations had no voice in aid distribution inside Tigray. Instead, all aid was handed over to the TPLF leaders. 60% of the respondents described how any individuals inquiring about food directly to aid organizations would be arrested. Now, that report was published, I think, shortly before I arrived. And since I've been here, I have sought to engage with the World Food Programme to ask them questions about this and other matters related to the convoy, including missing trucks, some of which they now say have been released. Some trucks that had been there since July they've just recently explained that some 100 of those have been returned. But I mean, the issues raised here are much more serious. They question whether or not the United Nations has any control over what is happening inside Tigray when it comes to the aid distribution, and the people that she interviewed also said that essentially the aid is being distributed on the basis of whether or not people are willing to fight, which is, I mean, there are previous reports about this, and this seems to confirm those reports. But I haven't seen any official response to these claims.
The concerns are reasonable, as the group in the region is well known for such criminalities since 1985. During the 1985 famine in Ethiopia, TPLF diverted 95% of the $100 million aid raised to fight famine in northern Ethiopia and spent it on weapons. The group is also known for its involvement in aid money transactions. Thompson also mentioned the recent reports of looting by TPLF on the warehouses of USAID, UNICEF and others in Amhara region of Ethiopia. And he urged the United Nations to provide an explanation about this.
The reports of those are long running, and I mean, in the previous phase of the war, from July through to December, it was quite clear that the trucks themselves had been repurposed for moving soldiers and for looting material from Amhara. I mean, on its face, there's clear evidence that UN resources, trucks, food, I mean, TPLF were also accused by USAID of looting their warehouses and taking food from UNICEF and from various other warehouses in Amhara. So, I mean, there's clear evidence that TPLF has been making use of UN resources that are humanitarian resources for the purposes of its war effort, and they have never answered any questions about that. And I don't think that's acceptable. They need to provide an explanation as to what efforts and what measures that they've taken to attempt to try to prevent the use of their supplies for helping the war effort in the country. I think we can conclude from Professor Anne Fitzgerald's research that there is reason to believe that that aid is being diverted inside of Tigray and being sold and to generate money. I think beyond that, the experience of in the 80s, which was reported, as far as I recall, by Martin Plaut, who is now an avowed TPLF supporter, involved sort of circular transactions, almost money laundering, being done with the aid, where the aid would be sold and then sold again and then sold again, to generate large amounts of cash, which I think were used to basically purchase arms, which were then used by the TPLF. Given the previous experience of TPLF activities in this area of aid diversion and basically taking advantage of humanitarian operations for the purposes of their military conflict, I think it's entirely reasonable for both the government of Ethiopia and any reasonable observer to consider that there's a distinct possibility that this is happening again.
Hence, the concerns of humanitarian aid diversion should be given the proper attention by the international community, particularly the UN humanitarian agencies.
The United Nations seems to interpret its principles of neutrality and impartiality to mean that it can't comment on things like this, but silence is also a way of basically supporting misinformation. I mean, if you have Dr. Tedros who's saying that there's a siege and not acknowledging that the TPLF are destroying hospitals within Afar Zone Region 2, at the same time as WFP is not saying anything about the reasons why they're not delivering aid, then people naturally can come to wrong conclusions. I mean, the silence actually facilitates the misinformation.
Alistair Thompson suggests the UN to provide an explanation regarding the issues, stating the fact that there is absence of transparent monitoring mechanisms in the humanitarian operation in Tigray to ensure that assistance has been reaching the needy people.
The first step is that there needs to be transparency about what has happened up till now in this conflict. There needs to be a clear accounting for all of the trucks which have been and have returned. There needs to be an accounting for the trucks that have been destroyed, blown up in the war effort, all of which I think is possible. The United Nations needs to publicly acknowledge that when aid deliveries were not made to Tigray, both in the period from July to December, but also from December till now, that the main reason for that failure to be able to deliver that aid was not an obstruction or a lack of food to deliver or a lack of willingness on behalf of the WFP to deliver it, but conflict which was instigated by the TPLF. I mean, they invaded Afar. Afar has been invaded pretty much continuously since July till April this year. And I mean that's the starting point. I think beyond that there needs to be some kind of clear transparency about what's happening inside Tigray.
According to him, the main issue related to humanitarian supply to Tigray is the lack of transparency and clarity about what is happening, what has happened, and why the deliveries are needed. The UN should look into the international humanitarian operation being carried out in Tigray region of Ethiopia in order to address the concerns about the proper delivery of aid to the people in the region.
I think in the current circumstances, some form of inquiry should actually be held by the United Nations into the operations of OSHA and the WFP from the beginning of this conflict, because there are also questions raised about what happened in the first few months of the conflict when it came to humanitarian operations. I mean, I was leaked a memo of an OSHA meeting which took place early in the conflict, and it was clear in that document that they were advising all of the humanitarian aid agencies who were operating not to take military escorts with them in their travels. And I mean, that's not in and of itself an unusual thing, but I mean, we have the testimony of the whistleblowers whose audio was leaked and published about their concerns about operations for the Tigray conflict being run out of Geneva and not out of Ethiopia. And I think there's questions that need to be asked about that. And then there's also the UN staff who were expelled. We don't really know the full reasons why they were expelled, but I mean, one of them, Kwesi, was clearly showing some degree of partiality and towards TPLF. And I think there is a significant issue inside the United Nations from the very top, from Tedros Adhanom, who has played perhaps the most vocal role in supporting this narrative about Tigray victimhood and about Tigray famine and Tigray genocide, that needs to be properly addressed. The issue of transparency here is that the conduct of the UN is questioned as well as the conduct of the TPLF. The UN appears to have turned a blind eye to two activities which should have raised concerns with them. And the UN does not appear to be very good at inquiring into its own conduct. I think they need to reconsider their communication protocols and be more transparent about what actually is happening and the observations that they're making. Simply confining their remarks and their comments and their answers to questions to only addressing questions of need is not enough in this situation, because their integrity is questioned here, and they should at least attempt to try to address those questions. Now, maybe they can't do so. Maybe that has to be done by the United Nations Secretary General and the officers of the political leadership of the United Nations, but somebody needs to address these questions. The questions about whether or not the United Nations has facilitated the use of its resources in a conflict against the people of Ethiopia.